I used to believe silence was harmless, that when love grows older, it simply learns to speak less. But lately, the quiet between Mark and me has started to feel like a living thing, something that watches us from across the dinner table, heavy and unblinking. Mark and I met 7 years ago in Boston, both too ambitious for our own good. He was deliberate where I was impulsive, a man who measured life in spreadsheets and tidy plans. For a long time, that steadiness felt like safety. Now it feels like distance. Our conversations have dwindled to reminders and logistics. Bills, deadlines, groceries. Spoken with the politeness of strangers, sharing an apartment lease. He blames work. I blame the version of us we no longer remember how to be. When his nephew Evan arrived one grey Friday in October, the house seemed to inhale again. Evan was 23, tall, restless, all unspent energy and easy laughter. He'd just graduated college and, according to Mark, needed a change of scenery after a bad breakup. I agreed to let him stay for a week, imagining the arrangement as a small kindness, a distraction from my own monotony. From the moment he stepped inside, he filled the rooms Mark had emptied with his absence. He noticed the little things, how I took my coffee, the old jazz playlist I kept on repeat, the framed photographs gathering dust on the hallway shelf. He talked, really talked, as if words were a bridge, and I was worth crossing to reach. That first evening, Mark called from the office, late again. He suggested Evan keep me company, his voice clipped with the casual confidence of someone certain there's no risk in the arrangement. I said fine. I always say fine. Evan offered to cook dinner, claiming he'd learned a few recipes in self-defense after college. The kitchen filled with the scent of garlic and the sound of him humming under his breath. I watched him move, uncomplicated, unhurried, and wondered when I'd stopped feeling that kind of ease in my own home. We ate together at the counter, talking about everything from music to failed relationships. I found myself laughing, an unguarded, startled sound I hadn't heard from my own mouth in months. When Mark finally called to say he'd be home past midnight, I felt something I couldn't quite name. Relief maybe, or guilt for feeling relieved. After Evan went to bed, I lingered in the kitchen, tracing the rim of my wine glass, listening to the echo of our laughter fade into the walls. The house felt warm again, almost alive, and that frightened me more than the silence ever had, because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't lonely, and that realization, small as it was, felt like the beginning of a storm I didn't yet understand. The next morning, the house was bathed in a pale, forgiving light. Mark had already left for work, his coffee mug still half full beside the sink. He hadn't even bothered to wake me before leaving. It wasn't unusual anymore. Just another quiet reminder of how easily we'd learned to live apart while still sleeping in the same bed. Evan was already in the living room, barefoot, scrolling through his phone. He looked up and grinned, that effortless, disarming smile that seemed to erase the years between us. "Morning out, Rachel. You take your coffee the same way, right? 2 sugars." The way he said it, casually observant, thoughtful, caught me off guard. Mark had stopped remembering things like that a long time ago. We sat together at the table, sipping coffee and pretending this was normal. He asked about my work at the local gallery, about the art exhibits I curated, about whether I ever painted myself. No one had asked me that in years. The conversation felt nourishing, like sunlight after a long winter. By noon, the quiet ache of the house didn't feel so sharp anymore. Evan followed me to the backyard, where the autumn leaves had begun to gather in golden drifts. We talked about everything: the future, heartbreak, the small disappointments that shape you when you aren't looking. His voice was gentle, unhurried, with that earnestness people have before life teaches them how to hide it. At one point he said, "You know, Uncle Mark talks about you a lot. Says you're the strong one. I smiled, but it hurt a little. Funny, he doesn't say much to me anymore. Evan hesitated, then lowered his gaze. Sometimes people stop trying because they think they've already lost. The words stayed with me long after he went inside. That evening, Mark came home late again. No apology, no explanation. I mentioned that Evan had cooked dinner, that we'd saved him a plate. He nodded absently, eyes already on his phone. The same loop we'd been trapped in for months repeated itself. Small talk, exhaustion, silence. But later, as I washed the dishes, I caught sight of my reflection in the kitchen window. Flushed, alert, alive. There was something unsettling in that image, something dangerous. Evan passed behind me, close enough for me to feel his warmth. He reached over to place a glass in the sink, his hand brushing mine by accident, or maybe not. Neither of us said a word, but the moment stretched between us, fragile and electric. I wanted to tell myself it meant nothing, that I was imagining things, but deep down, I already knew. The line between comfort and temptation had begun to blur, and once that line fades, it never truly returns. By the third evening, the rhythm of our days had quietly shifted. Mark's absences had become so routine, they no longer required excuses. Evan filled the spaces he left behind, cooking dinner, fixing the old record player, making me laugh until my sides hurt. It felt easy, too easy, like slipping into a version of life I'd forgotten I wanted. But with ease came danger. Every glance lingered a second too long. Every laugh felt charged with something unspoken. I told myself it was harmless. A temporary companionship, nothing more. Yet part of me knew I was lying. That night, rain drummed steadily against the windows. Mark had texted that he'd be working late again. I didn't even reply. Evan and I ended up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, playing an old trivia game we found in the cabinet. "You're terrible at this," he teased, grinning as he wrote down another point. "Maybe I'm letting you win," I said. Though my voice came out softer than I intended, he laughed, the sound low and warm, and for a moment, the whole world felt smaller. Just the two of us, a quiet house, and the steady rhythm of the rain. Then the power flickered and went out. The room fell into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of candlelight from the kitchen. I should have stood up, found my phone, called Mark, anything to break the tension. But instead, I stayed. Evan shifted closer. His shoulder brushed mine, and I could feel his heartbeat. Fast, uncertain. I turned toward him, meaning to say something light, something to remind us both of where the line was. But when I met his eyes, the words dissolved. "Rachel," he said quietly, almost like a confession. I froze. There was something raw in his voice. Not flirtation, not playfulness, but something deeper, needier. "You deserve more than waiting for someone who never shows up," he whispered. The words hit harder than they should have, because they were true, because I'd spent months pretending I wasn't waiting. I stood quickly, needing space, needing air. "Evan, you should go to bed," I said, though my voice shook. He nodded, his expression unreadable. I didn't mean to make things complicated, but things were already complicated. When he disappeared down the hall, I stood in the living room, surrounded by the faint smell of candle wax and rain, my pulse still racing. Somewhere deep down, beneath all my guilt and restraint, I realized I didn't want the night to end. And that was the most dangerous thought of all. Because once desire finds its voice, silence can't hold it forever. The following morning felt heavy, almost suffocating. I woke before dawn, the grey light filtering through the blinds, and found Evan already in the kitchen. He was silent, methodical, making coffee as though yesterday had never happened. But I could feel the weight between us, a tension that didn't need words to exist. I wanted to speak, to acknowledge the spark, the closeness that had grown in just a few days. But when I opened my mouth, the words tangled in guilt and fear. How could I explain that the safest parts of me had leaned toward him, even if nothing had crossed the final line? Evan broke the silence. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly, turning to meet my eyes. "I know what's going on inside you." My heart skipped. How could he see me so clearly? I don't want things to be complicated," I whispered, though I already knew they were. "Complicated isn't the same as wrong," he replied, his voice gentle, insistent. "Sometimes it's just life, reminding us that we've been invisible for too long." I left the kitchen to wash the dishes, pretending I hadn't heard. Each plate I rinsed felt heavier than the last, coated with a residue of shame I couldn't scrub away. Evan followed silently, placing a hand on my shoulder as I worked. I didn't pull away, even though every instinct screamed I should. Mark came home that evening, later than usual, his coat dripping from the rain outside. I caught the brief glance he gave me, polite, detached. Before he buried himself in emails and phone calls, I realized in that moment how hollow our home had become. How easily two people can coexist without truly seeing each other. After dinner, Evan lingered in the living room, his presence quiet but charged. I tried to focus on the television, but my thoughts kept spiraling. I wondered if Mark suspected, if he would ever notice the change in me, or whether he was too absorbed in his own world to care. At some point, Evan spoke, his voice breaking the hum of the evening. "Rachel, I have to leave tomorrow," he said, and the words hit like a sudden storm. I wanted to beg him to stay, to admit what I hadn't even fully acknowledged to myself, but I only nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I understand," I said softly, though it was anything but understanding. He smiled sadly, leaning over to press a quick kiss to my forehead. A gesture innocent enough, but loaded with the intimacy we had cultivated in these few, short days. My chest tightened. I knew then that the night had changed something fundamental. It wasn't a betrayal of actions, but of the heart, and in that silent small act, I recognized a truth I could no longer ignore. Loneliness and longing had the power to rewrite even the strongest commitments, leaving you wondering where loyalty ends and desire begins. As Evan left, I stood by the doorway, watching him disappear into the rainy night. The house felt empty, yet somehow heavier than before. Charged with the weight of unspoken confessions, I realized then that the storm had only just begun. Inside me, inside my marriage, inside the quiet house that had always promised safety, but had delivered nothing but emptiness. The days after Evan left were quieter than I expected, but not peaceful. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to fill the empty spaces that neither Mark nor I had acknowledged for months. I moved through it like a ghost, tracing familiar corners that suddenly felt unfamiliar, haunted by the memory of laughter that had made me feel seen for the first time in years. Mark noticed my quiet, but only in passing. He asked if I was tired, if I wanted to go out, never touching the deeper questions. I realized then that our marriage had become a series of polite gestures, a careful choreography of routine that left no room for vulnerability. He was present, yes, but only in form, and I had been complicit in my own invisibility. I thought about Evan constantly, not in longing, not in desire, but in the sharp awareness of what it meant to feel truly noticed. That awareness was both exhilarating and terrifying. It revealed the cracks I had ignored in my own heart, the desires I had buried beneath politeness and routine. One evening, I found myself staring at the doorway as Mark prepared dinner, his movements mechanical and precise. I realized I no longer envied the life we had built together. Or rather, I envied it only for the comfort it represented, not for the connection it lacked. The silence between us was no longer simply empty. It was a mirror reflecting everything we had left unspoken. I finally confronted him, not with anger, not with accusations, but with the quiet truth I had been avoiding. "We've been living parallel lives," I said softly. "I don't know if we can fix that." Mark didn't answer immediately. He put down the pan, leaned against the counter, and met my gaze. For the first time in months, I felt him see me, really see me. But there was no sudden miracle, no instant resolution, only recognition, only acknowledgement that the life we had built, the love we thought was steady, required more than routines and quiet assurances. Over the next weeks, we talked. Sometimes we argued. Sometimes we sat in silence together, simply learning to share the same space without pretending everything was fine. It was exhausting, painful, but necessary. Evan's brief presence had become a catalyst, a mirror showing me not only what I desired, but also what I had neglected in my marriage. I learned that love is not static. It requires attention, honesty, and courage. The courage to confront your own failings, and the courage to let another see them. Sometimes it also requires absence, to remind you of what you've taken for granted. Evan never returned, and in that absence, I found clarity. I began to see myself again, my needs, my wants, my worth. Mark and I did not suddenly become the people we once were, nor did we solve every quiet grievance, but we began to acknowledge them, and perhaps that is enough. A fragile beginning, a tentative attempt to rebuild trust and intimacy, knowing full well that the lessons learned in a single week can echo for a lifetime. Because sometimes it isn't the grand gestures that save a marriage. It's the willingness to finally face the quiet and to listen when someone, anyone, reminds you that you are not invisible.